Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about history, culture, politics, literature, and just general society in this snowy land that we call Canada. Today, we have a very special guest, one who is the author of Dread Poetry and Freedom, Linton Kwesi Johnson, and The Unfinished Revolution, as well as the editor of Moving Against the System, the 1968 Congress of Black Writers and the Making of Global Consciousness, as well as You Don't Play with Revolution, the Montreal Lectures of C.L.R. James. Our guest's writing engages with the work of C.L.R. James, Frantz Fanon, Sylvia Wynter, Hannah Arendt, Walter Rodney, as well as Linton Kwesi Johnson in relation to politics, poetry, and social movement. A former youth worker and community organizer, he has also produced radio documentaries for the CBC's Ideas on James and Fanon. He currently teaches in the Humanities, Philosophy, and Religion Department at John Abbott College and the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. We are happy to have on the show David Austin to talk about the re-release of his book, Fear of a Black Nation. David, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, Patrick. Thank you.
So, I guess the broadest question that we have first, can you describe the book Fear of a Black Nation for those that might not have an awareness of what it is?
In some ways, I would describe it as a meditation on social transformation through the prism of history, through the history of the 1960s, especially the late 1960s in Montreal. But Montreal as a transnational political site of Black radical politics. So it's basically me looking back and through the 1960s to think about questions of race alongside class, alongside gender, and trying to think about, in some ways, how that history informs or can inform our understanding of the present, and not just in terms of the Montreal Canadian context, but in a kind of in a global context, I would say.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And I think an always relevant question to ask in this case, what impact not just events in history have, but the idea of history in this case can have on the way we operate as a society. I absolutely agree in this case. It's one that perhaps is underlooked in contemporary society, like the idea of history, because it's very much taken for granted, I think, in many ways.
And what history does, or what history can do. I know there's that debate, as to whether this thing called history just exists for its own sake and on its own terms, or whether there's a way that we can look to history to glean something, in terms of the line of continuity, in terms of the present, right? Understanding how we got here, but also understanding how folks in one historical moment address certain issues or questions and how those might inform our understanding how we may approach those questions, not as a blueprint, but approach those questions in our current context, including around policing and surveillance, for example.
Absolutely. And before we get actually into the meat of the book, is there any kind of historical context that you feel would be relevant to mention in this case, especially as it pertains to this book, before we get into the 1960s proper?
Well, it's Montreal, Quebec, and Canada's and North America's 1960s, which by extension becomes, because of the history of migration, becomes part of the Caribbean's 1960s, right? And I say migration from the Caribbean, but also migration from the United States across the border to Canada, and also intermigration. Black folks moving from one city to the next is part of the early historical context in which large numbers of Black Nova Scotians migrate to Montreal, and some of them are working as porters on trains. African Americans are doing so in the early part of the 20th century. People from the West Indies, from the Caribbean, are also doing so in the early part of the 20th century. They're building organizations like the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the organization that was established by Marcus Garvey and also Amy Ashford Garvey. Organizations like the Negro Community Center, the Colored Women's Club, religious organizations like the Union United Church, I mean, all of these are institutions that become important in the first quarter of the 20th century in terms of humanizing or serving to humanize the existence of people of African descent in the Montreal context, which was largely a context of de facto segregation, where people of African descent, Black folks, lived below the tracks for the most part, largely concentrated in the Southwest, what is St. Henry, Little Burgundy, especially Little Burgundy. And, as a result of the circumstances, were forced to, build these institutions, organizations, in order to address, as I said, de facto segregation, the genuine various forms of racial exclusion that Black folks live with on a daily basis, which affected employment, which affected education, which affected their day-to-day lives in the most simple, everyday, mundane way. So these institutions were there quite early. And also, if you read Dorothy Williams' work, where she talks about the various newspapers that were established by members of the Black community in Montreal, all of this was part of humanizing their existence, and also a form of kind of social, cultural, political expression. And that context, that historical context, is very important because, particularly when we take the UNIA, for example, when events begin to unfold at Sir George Williams University, what is now Concordia, in the late 1960s, that becomes a haven, becomes a meeting ground for people to meet and discuss and plan and to strategize in terms of how to respond to the fact that a number of Black students had been arrested. I'll say one other thing just as a kind of anecdote, because it's an important anecdote, because it gives some notion of the significance of the UNIA. So Malcolm X's mother, Louise Langdon, arrives in Montreal from Grenada, 1917, and becomes one of the founding members of what would become Montreal's chapter of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which, for folks who don't know, was probably the largest mass movement to emerge in the United States in the early part of the 20th century, at least.
Yeah.
Right? Millions of followers, hundreds of thousands of followers around the world, chapters on the African continent, in England, Ireland, Wales. Cuba alone had 50 chapters of this organization. Influenced people like members of the ANC and Nelson Mandela, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. So it's hard, in some ways, it's almost hard to overstate the significance of this organization. And Montreal's chapter was officially established in 1919, and Louise Langdon was one of the founders of that chapter. She was active in Montreal for a few years before marrying Malcolm X's father, Earl Little, and moving to the United States. So it just gives us some kind of glimpse in terms of, the active nature of the community. I also should say that, men worked largely, many men worked as porters on the trains, and many women worked as domestic workers, right? But there was also a thriving music scene, a jazz scene. A lot of the city produced a number of really important jazz musicians. Obviously, the one that's most well known is Oscar Peterson. And there was a time when it was debated, who was the greatest, pianist of that jazz era, Oscar Peterson or Thelonious Monk. Oscar Peterson was obviously that good as a musician. And there were women who worked as showgirls in the clubs as dancers, right? So there's a very rich historical context that is cultural, historical, political. There's all part of the same package in terms of how do people respond to their particular environment, right? In this case, how do Black folks in Montreal respond to their particular environment, right? And these were various ways in terms of employment, in terms of cultural institutions, in terms of socio-political institutions, if we want to call them that. How folks work towards humanizing their existence in an environment that was racially hostile. And just to say, obviously, class becomes a factor because, the racial hostility becomes a component part of how folks were forced to live their lives, right? As working class people, cleaning, working as domestic workers in folks' homes, working as porters on the trains. And even if they were able to make a decent living as musicians, they still dealt with the ravages of racial exclusion. So that's an important point to make, I think, because sometimes when we talk about race, we kind of forget that race is not just about race, right? It impinges on people's lives in ways that are gendered, that are socioeconomic, in other words, tied to class, etc. So that was absolutely the case in the lives of the folks that we're talking about.
Absolutely. And I do really appreciate, this is something that you see in other works as well, but I do still appreciate the mention that you make of the Caribbean influence, and it's something that we'll come to a bit later. I have a question on that, but it's something that I think we tend to forget. And I remember talking about this with George Eliot Clark when he came on the show as well, of how this kind of Atlantic triangle, so to speak, goes beyond, but is still intrinsically related to the Atlantic slave trade, right? That happened. So these connections, again, to bring back to something you said at the beginning of recording in this case, these connections go beyond just events in history, but the way that that history kind of shapes society going forward. And I just wanted to say that I think it's a very important point that you made in this case to underline, is that particular one, which we'll come back to in this case. But yeah, I didn't know that anecdote about Malcolm X in this case that you were saying. It's very interesting. Yeah.
Folks are usually surprised to hear that, but as you just said, it speaks to the transnational nature of we talk about history as if these borders are fixed, but in reality, they're fluid and they're porous, right? So somebody can be from the West Indies one minute, have an impact in Canada on another moment, and and next thing you know, they're active in the United States, as Louise Langdon and Earl Little were as members of the UNIA, very active. And in addition to that, they brought into being this profoundly important historical figure that we know as Malcolm X today. And I think it's a little known but very important part of Malcolm X's background and that historical period from the early 1900s. Merle Collins, who's a Grenadian writer, scholar, and beautiful poet and fiction writer, is, from what I understand, writing about a book about Louise Langdon.
Yeah. Getting into the book proper in this case. So we're here to talk about how Fear of a Black Nation has been re-released in this case, 10 years later. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Like what kind of brought you to actually approach this topic in the first place in 2013, and why you decided that, 10 years later now it would be a good time to re-release, in this case with added material?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so the book has been in print since, so there have been reprints. It's been in print since 2013. But 10 years, this becomes one of those markers where it becomes, it's a nice round number, so it becomes an opportunity to kind of look backwards a little bit and think about, whatever impact the book may have had and its significance, and also the structure of the book in terms of the core of the book has not changed, but to add some additional material that I think, sheds some light and, provides some historical context in terms of, what brought the book into being. So, yeah, I think, it's a little bit trite, right? But it really, a big part of it was, that 10-year anniversary as a marker. Having said that, it's been interesting to observe, the various routes that the book has taken. The fact that it's been taken up in colleges and universities in the Canadian, North American context, but also because it's transnational. Folks use it in the UK, for example, and also in the Caribbean. But also, like, what is important for me is that I generally try to consciously write to reach a wide cross section of people. I mean, in terms of accessibility, without sacrificing complexity. And it's something I consciously think about when I'm writing. So I think, in some respects, what I'm most proud of in relation to the book is that people who are politically active have taken up the book and used the book and thought about the book. In other words, it's serving its purpose in terms of thinking about one moment to inform another historical moment, political moment that we're in. Um, uh, so that has been really instructive for me. But the other thing is, because of how I came into thinking about the 1960s, and it involves a little bit of a story, but I'm going to just give the short version. I lived in Montreal for 2 years between 1980 and 82, when I went to elementary school. But before that, I lived in England. And I came back to Montreal in 1990, a year and a half after I finished high school, partly because, and I'm not saying I was consciously aware of this at the time, but I look back at it in retrospect and realize that was the case, because the time spent in third world books and crafts on Bathurst Street in Toronto, where I went to junior high school and high school, reading Walter Rodney's The Grounding with My Brothers, among other books, including an anthology by Dennis Forsyth on the Sir George William protest, I realized that there was something peculiar about Montreal in the 1960s, where it was that important transnational political site where Canadian, Caribbean, transnational North American, including African American politics converge in one place. And also within the context, which I began to explore more over time, within the context of Quebec and Canadian nationalism, right?
Absolutely.
And the 1960s internationalism. So in some respects, I feel as though that's what brought me back to Montreal. And then I encountered people as a young adult who were the living embodiment of that history, right? They were some of them were still here, and through them I met other folks, right? So this was really a kind of oral historical experience for me initially, just hearing people talk about their stories. And for some strange reason in those days, I used to walk around with a tape recorder, and sometimes people would come and give a talk and we record it, or sometimes, there'd be informal conversations and people would be okay with me recording it. And, some of that now is, very strangely part of the historical record, but that was not in the early to mid 1990s. That was not necessarily the case. Sometimes it was very deliberate. So I worked when I was at undergraduate at McGill, I worked for the McGill Daily. I was also involved in CKUT Radio. So sometimes it was very a conscious decision to record things. I also used to work doing television interviews for what was then called Black Is. So sometimes we would have guests in the city, and we would video record the interview, and I would audio record the interview. We'd use it on radio and on what was cable television at the time, and also in print, right? So that's kind of how it began. And I'm saying all of that to say that, what is interesting now, I had this interesting moment. So one of the people that was actively involved in that historical period, even though they lived in Toronto, was somebody named Robert Hill. He's from a prominent political family in Jamaica, the Hills. He's C.L.R. James's literary executor and one of the leading authorities on C.L.R. James, the Marxist theorist from Trinidad, but also one of the leading authorities on the UNI and the Garvey movement, arguably, well, say the leading authority. And, he was interviewed for this series that's going to air on CBC in the fall called Black Life, which is an 8-part series on Black life in Canada, television series. And I remember his reaction when I called him to tell him that some folks were wanted to interview him. This is like a seasoned academic, taught for 20 plus years, maybe even 30 plus years at UCLA, now retired. And he was on the other end of the phone, and I could, he paused for a second, and I could tell he was a little bit choked up. And the point was that, things that he had been doing as a student, just out of conviction, somebody from Jamaica who became active in Canada as a student at U of T, but the organization called the Caribbean Conference Committee and the CLR James Study Circle was based in Montreal. He was like, wow, that work that we were just doing out of conviction is now history. And it's now going to reach the stage where it's not just history being written about in books, because he's an integral part of Fear of a Black Nation, but it's going to be on television. Like thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are going to be watching this thing in video. So it's been a lesson for me in terms of how history moves and how things come full circle, right? And it's the accumulation of the conversations and research, public and private discussions about that historical moment and its relevance for our time, etc., that has allowed, and I'm saying not just by me, but by the people that were involved, by other people that write about that period, etc. It's the culmination of all of that that has led to it now being available for popular consumption, on television. And even though I know, of course, people live in silos in terms of the media that they listen to or watch, etc.
Of course. Yeah.
But then, the CBC is still the CBC in the Canadian context, meaning that, it represents something that says something on a national scale, if that makes any sense. And also, I think in a world where we live in social media silos, there's still something to be said for simultaneity. The fact that, yes, people will watch it after the fact, but at some moment in the fall, tens of thousands of people will be watching that particular episode and others, right, which is about history that people made, 50 plus years ago. And, that was his reaction. So, that's a long way of also saying that the 10th anniversary edition for me is part of that equation. It's part of like reflecting on 10 years, but it's also the last 50 plus years of what that historical moment means.
Absolutely. I know it's a small part of this very complex and interesting answer in this case, but I really enjoy the tape recorder element that you brought up in this case, and really points to the fact of how you can address history in so many quote unquote unofficial forms of narrative in this case, right? I think since the 70s that has started to change in this case with the rise of social history and so on. But I think it's still such an important step in this case to actually go out and seek sources in unconventional, I guess, places, or considered unconventional places. And I guess that kind of leads me to my next question in this case. Is this something that you thought about actively when you were researching this book, right? Of taking in these unconventional sources like recordings or just regular conversations. And I guess this is my way of asking a bit more broadly, like, how did you approach the research of this topic?
Well, it's funny, Patrick, because by the time that I started writing Fear of a Black Nation, there was already a narrative or a story in my head. And, but I realized at a certain moment that that story for me felt like a bit of a broken record, because I'd been speaking about, writing about, exploring in various ways, even for school newspaper or what used to be Our Magazine in Montreal, an English weekly newspaper, or the Montreal Mirror. I had written about this stuff going back to the early mid 1990s, and I came to feel at a certain point that I had a narrative in my head that was stuck. The Congress of Writers, who was here, all these big, pretty much stars of the Black Power period during that historical moment. And then the Congress, so George Williams protest happens, and the burning of the computer center, and people are arrested, and the police did this, etc. There's something kind of spectacular about that kind of narrative, in the sense of who is present at the Congress. The burning of the 9th floor of the computer center on the 9th floor in the Sir George, the Hall building at Sir George, right? So those are kind of big events, right? But that's not the story in and of itself. And so I began actually to kind of move away from telling that story, or at least in my head, I began to move away, although people would ask me to, and I felt that in another sense, I had a responsibility, because I was sharing stories that were shared with me. This was, at this point, there was no sort of archival research. What I did have in my possession, which is actually now available between the lines, is the audio recordings of the Congress of Black Writers. So I knew what it sounded like. And there were recordings of C.L.R. James speaking in Montreal in 1966 and 1967, which have been published as You Don't Play with Revolution, James's Montreal lecture. So I had that, right? And I had those voices in my head. But, you know, I became reluctant at a certain point to talk about that period because I thought that there was more to be said, and it was just like repeating the same song. And basically what happened is, you know, conducting more interviews with folks, including Robert Hill, and there were other folks. At one point I was working on a documentary on C.L.R. James for CBC Ideas. And it meant I traveled to England and Trinidad and to the States, various parts of the States, to conduct interviews. And, you know, it began to fill out the story, right? Robert Hill talking in more detail about his involvement during the Congress and in the 1960s in general in Montreal and in the Canadian context. You know, folks in Trinidad, folks in Detroit who are part of James's organization called Facing Reality, of which Robert Hill, Franklin Harvey, Alfie Robertson, some others were actually involved in. They were members of the organization. They participated in the organization's conversations. So I began to look at their correspondence eventually, some of which is in archives, would be at Wayne State University. And then Alfie Roberts had his own archive as the one person from the C.L.R. James Study Circle that had remained in Montreal from the 1960s, whether it's Rosie Douglas or Franklin Harvey or Robert Hill or Tim Hector. They went back to their respective countries, or in the case of Robert Hill, he went back to Jamaica, then eventually to the United States, right? But Alfie Roberts remained here. So when he passed away in 1996, his archive, which was in his basement, he lived on the South Shore at that time, right? I became responsible for organizing it, etc. And then you began to see, well, there's all this literature, you know, conference programs, correspondence, their publications that began to fill in the story. So it began to look a little bit different. And slowly but surely, I began to sort of put these different pieces together alongside the story that was in my head, the story that I had inherited from people through interviews, through informal conversations, and through formal interviews eventually too. So, you know, it happened very organically. And then at one point it became a conscious, very deliberate set of actions, right? That I was piecing this story together. But then even having said that, you know, the funny thing is that the agreement to publish a book with Between the Lines was to publish the proceedings of the Congress of Black Writers.
Oh,
that
interesting.
that was the agreement. And I was supposed to write an introduction to that book. And strangely enough, what happened is that when I began writing the introduction, the short introduction became longer and longer. And then it became clear that there was a book to be written about that historical moment, of which the Congress was a part, but it wasn't the story on its own. So I'm sort of responsible for this, but I feel as though you know, Fear of a Black Nation is not about the Congress of Black Writers or Sir George. Like, there's one chapter on Sir George and there's one on the Congress. It is really about that historical moment, right? And those two events, obviously because of their spectacular nature, as I said, you know, they occupy a lot of space. But I think to describe it as a book about, not that you described it that way, but it's often referred to as a book about Sir George and the Congress of Black Writers, is a sort of a mischaracterization of the book. But as I'm saying, I'm actually the one that's guilty of kind of characterizing it that way in terms of how it's described. But when you read the contents of the book, you know, it's really trying to think through that period in terms of, you know, how were people of African descent, how were Black folks living in this city called Montreal, imagining the possibilities of freedom, right, in a moment of unfreedom. You know, in other words, what was the response of Black folks in Montreal to what we might refer to as the Du Boisian problem? They talked about at the turn of the 20th century, the problem of the color line, right? Yeah. In other words, the problem of emancipation alongside ongoing unfreedom. And that's one way, that's how I've come to sort of think about the history of the 20th and early 21st century. When you think about the problems that we're dealing with in our context today. And it's funny because for the first time this year, I taught The Souls of Black Folks and also Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. And I just, emphasizing to the students that you realize what Du Bois is describing here in The Souls of Black Folks is a historical moment at the end of the American Civil War, right? And you have the Reconstruction period, and Reconstruction fails, or actually it's sabotaged, right? And all of these dynamics that we think about today in terms of race, alongside class, in terms of the electoral, debates, right? And people being disenfranchised, even around gun control, right? And why some people feel the need to be armed to protect themselves against other people, right? So much of it goes back to that historical period in which the United States could have gone in one direction or another, right? Particularly in terms of alongside race. But of course, this was not just about race and exercising power, but this was also, a huge economic undertaking in terms of how do you get those who have been emancipated to force them back to plantations, right? Or to exploit their labor in other forms, right? Then that becomes part of the mass migration from the South to the North. And when I say from the South to the North, it's from the Southern United States, including to Canada, not just cities like New York, Detroit, and Chicago and Philadelphia, right? But it's also part of into the 20th century, when you think about like the economics of the Americas, right? That migration from the South includes like the Caribbean, where people are migrating from the various Caribbean islands in Cuba, from Puerto Rico, from Jamaica, from Haiti, from Trinidad, etc., right, in search of economic opportunities in North American cities. So, which is one of the reasons why it's impossible to talk about the Harlem Renaissance without talking about the Caribbean, the disproportionate Caribbean influence. The Garvey movement centered in New York, with various, Caribbean figures like Claude McKay and, Hubert Harrison, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So Montreal, in terms of going back to this idea of the porous border, right, is an integral part of that set of networks and that migration and those was one of those cities which we can almost map out in terms of like the jazz scene, right? There's various stops on the jazz circuit, right, which also map out points of migration, demographic shifts too. So, all of this kind of comes into fruition, at least in terms of my understanding of it, by, carrying those stories that have been shared to me orally, right, and through, just day-to-day conversation, and being a bit more systematic in terms of interviewing folks, more research, going to archives in England and in Trinidad, in the United States, and of course here, including the National Archives in Ottawa, where among others, Clarence Baines' archives are kept. And at some point, it became very consciously, well, there's a story. There are layers to this story that need to be told, and I have a bit of that story in my head, which is now being sort of supported and substantiated through additional research. But there's still a great deal to be said about that historical moment. It's far from having been exhausted, very far from being exhausted. In fact, I just wanted to mention there's a PhD thesis by Paul Hebert, who was at the University of Michigan, that looks at the same historical period in a great deal of depth in Montreal too. There are other folks who are writing masters and PhD theses, maybe looking at Toronto and other parts. But in many respects, although Fair of a Black Nation in some way has served to help frame how we understand that period, right? It doesn't exhaust it in any shape or form. And and this is one of the reasons why, and I say this with respect to my good friend Steve Hyde, incredible historian. I think quote unquote pure history does a different work, and it's work that I have to, so for example, Robert Hill, who I mentioned, is a historian's historian, right? I mean, he's a great mind, and he's a real, he probably in another life under different circumstances would have been a philosopher. But he brings it all to bear on how he understands history. But his attention to detail and his attention to archives, right, is what makes him a historian's historian. There are elements of that in Fear of a Black Nation, but it's far from exhausted, right? I'm trying to tell a story about a particular moment, and there are certain actors or characters in the story who played a prominent political role, well out of proportion to the size of the group and the number of people involved, right? And that for me is the story in terms of how we think about how we organize, or part of the story of how we think about how we organize for social change in our moment, right? It's not always going to be a mass movement, right? Or a catalyst may come from other places. It may be a small group of like-minded people who are thinking about organizing in a particular kind of way. And the work that they do, and this is hence Robert Hill's response when, I was on that phone call with him, may have reverberations in many different parts of the world that were not even necessarily intended, right? Maybe even not even necessarily even hoped for because they were not imagined, right? And so in many respects, that historical period is about the historical political imagination in a historical moment and where that can take folks. So it's really, for me, a book about social change.
Very interesting. I like that framing very much of, especially what you were mentioning at the beginning of like the history, or at least looking at the 60s as almost an idea in and of themselves, right? That kind of time, how could I say it, is vehicling or channeling a kind of energy, so to speak, in Montreal and in the international Black community in itself. And you see this, in other examples across the world as well. So, but I'm interested in this case about, I know it's not the central focus of your book, as you mentioned in this case, but I am still interested in knowing more about the Congress of Black Writers. You mentioned the 1969 protest at Sir George Williams in this case, and that's something I'm much more familiar with because I attended Concordia, and it's still, I think, part of the way we speak about the history of Montreal. But I have to admit that the 68 Congress of Black Writers is not something that we know, or at least that I feel like we speak a lot about or frequently about, both in common discourse and even in academia. So can you tell me, or the listeners, a bit more about what that Congress was and perhaps what its significance?
Sure. And, and so the funny thing is, in my mind, it's inconceivable to talk about one without the other, right? So it's interesting that people know about Sir George, it is true. But many of the same actors, political actors, were involved in both events. So, for example, Rosie Douglas, who went to prison for his role in Sir George, was the chair, one of the co-chair of the Congress of Black Writers, one of the co-conveners, along with Elder Thibault, who was from Haiti. If you look at the list of people that were on the organizing committee of the Congress of Black Writers, many of them were involved in Sir George in one form or another, including Philippe Fils-Aimé, also from Haiti. Right? So the two events are interconnected in terms of people, but they're also interconnected in this way, because when the students at Sir George filed their complaint against a professor at Concordia, right, a complaint of racism inside the classroom, and the university did not respond in April 1960 in a favorable way, many people sort of assumed that it was, the case was closed. But then the Congress of Black Writers happens in October 1968, and you have figures like Richard Small. Robert Hill comes back to Canada from Jamaica. Walter Rodney, the great Walter, historian and political figure from Guyana. Harry Edwards, who was one of the people that helped to orchestrate the 1968 Black Power protests during the Mexico Olympics. James Foreman, a former leader of SNCC and was, associated with the Black Panther Party to a certain extent, and a mentor to the younger generation of Black Power figures. Of course, Stokely Carmichael, who during that moment may have been one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. And CLR James, Richard B. Moore, from Barbados, the early member of the Communist Party in the United States, and became this kind of independent Black intellectual. Many of these folks, and centered in New York, in Harlem during the Renaissance period, going back to that period. So this was a major historical event by any standard, right? It was a transnational event in terms of it happened in Montreal, but when you look at the roster of people who participated, and others who I'm not mentioning right now, right? So it was a major historical event that took place in Montreal. You could argue that because of Montreal's transnational nature, not to mention the large Haitian community in Montreal, the growing Haitian community in Montreal at the time, that it took on that air where Haitian politics was talked about, and when James talked about the Haitian Revolution and delivered one presentation in French, that happened because this is Montreal in terms of the various languages that are spoken here. So in some respects, I would say it was, the event would have been very different if it was held in another city. The event was obviously very gendered, and so far as all the people I just mentioned were men. If you look at the list of people who spoke, they were all men. There were people like Joan Jones and Barbara Jones, the poet and geneticist who participated in more informal ways. I didn't mention Rocky Jones, who was the only Black Canadian who participated in the Congress, but from his own admission, Joan Jones, his wife, his partner, was the one that politicized him, right? Was that one that introduced him to politics and to like various books by whether it be Fanon or Malcolm X, etc. So, but as was quite typical of the 1960s, like the Black men were the spokespersons, right? And the women were sort of, receded in the background, even though they played a very prominent organizational role. So having said all of that, and you just imagine, 1968, in the height of the 1960s, in the height of Quebec nationalism, Canada's trying to sort of work out its own identity as a nation state, especially in relation to the United States, right? And these folks converge on Montreal for Canadian Thanksgiving weekend. It was electrifying, and you can now listen to the audio and hear for yourself like the response to things that were said, whether it be Stokely or other people, what people are applauding for, etc. Right? And so it really gives you an insight into what that historical moment was like. Quebec nationalists were present, in the audience, and thinking about what was being said by Black folks in relation to their own experience, in the province of Quebec in relation to English Canadians. And it's worth saying that there were a number of Quebec nationalists who were involved, as in terms of showing solidarity during the Sir George Williams protests. Philippe Pisame has talked about that. So it was kind of a who's who of the kind of Black radical left. Increasingly as I look back at that moment, I think about, in many ways, many of the folks involved were socialist or socialistic, or they were speaking from the Black left perspective and trying to figure out, what does this new form of society look like, and particularly for people of African descent, like what kind of world are we going to live in, right? And of course, one of the things that happens when you talk about the 1960s is that there's this kind of bifurcation of movements. Now, of course, folks organize autonomously various movements, whether it be the women's movement, the Black Power civil rights movement, etc. But they didn't exist in silos, right? And there's a way in which, in terms of 1960s historiography, talks, has the civil rights movement, Black Power movement in one corner, and they'll write about Students for a Democratic Society or the anti-Vietnam War movement, as if Black folks were not part of those movements too, or as if the civil rights Black Power movement didn't play a huge, even catalytic role in some of those movements, right? And you see the same thing playing itself out in the Canadian context, where up until recently, a lot of the books on the 1960s would talk about various student movements, protests, etc. And then Sir George or the Congress would not be mentioned, or the way that various Black groups of peoples organized beyond those events from one day to the next as part of the 1960s. would not be mentioned, or be a footnote somewhere. So that's beginning to change a little bit, but there was a time when the Congress would not be mentioned at all, as if it was as if the event did not happen. But one of the things I wanted to say about the Congress in relation to Sir George is that people participating during the Congress of Black Writers, many of whom were students at what is now Concordia at Sir George, after hearing those speeches and presentations, it was almost impossible for them to just sort of, these speeches about Black power, and Black political organizing, etc. It was virtually impossible for them to sort of sit back and allow the grievance that they had filed in April of that same year to let it pass. So in other words, the Congress served as a catalyst for what would become the Sir George Williams protest. That moment was part of what George Katsiapakis, the kind of 60s historian, sociologist, is referred to as the Eros effect. Right. There's and that's a very interesting way, I think, to kind of capture the spirit of that period, because, there are all kinds of theories and ideas about why the 1960s were the 1960s. And they're all viable, or they're all probably pieces of the same puzzle. Right. But some of the pieces that get left out is, for example, nationalism and independence movements throughout the world, but in this case, I would say the African continent, right? Third world liberation struggles, the Algerian independence movement, without which we don't have The Wretched of Europe by Frantz Fanon. If we had to pick one text and suggest that there was one book that was probably the most influential book of the 1960s on the widest range of people, I would argue that it's probably The Wretched of the Earth on an international,
I would be hard pressed to disagree
yeah,
with that, actually. Yeah.
members of the New Left in North America, right? Indigenous groups are reading The Wretched of the Earth, and when he talks about natives, like translating his language of nativity to their own circumstances. Who else? Quebec nationalists who are reading Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire, his poetry, but also discourse on colonialism in the 1950s in French.
Still see it today, with Glenn Coulthard, right?
Absolutely.
Redskins, White Masks, right?
No,
he pulls heavily
absolutely.
from Fanon, right?
No,
and this book came out like 5 years ago.
Absolutely. And it's part of that continuity, right? That he's very conscious of. But the reason why I mentioned Quebec nationalists in the Montreal context, because they're reading him in French in the 1950s. When Black Skins, White Masks, Peau Noir, Masque Blanc is published in, is it 56, 57, somewhere around there, maybe even a little bit earlier, right? Folks are reading it in French. They're reading Aimé Césaire in French, right? They're reading The Wretched of the Earth in the early 1960s in French, when it's not available in English yet until like 4 or 5 years later. So, and then of course it's being read in various contexts in Europe. It's being read on the African continent. It's being read, it's being read in the Middle East, right? So a range of people are reading this book. It's being translated into Farsi, into Arabic, Spanish, German, etc. I think you'd be hard pressed. And Fanon's presence was very much present during the Congress of Black writers. So, I think there's a way that the 1960s could be written through the work of Frantz Fanon, through Malcolm X's autobiography in the 1960s. Is a very influential book, on Malcolm X's writings in general, but people, an influence on members of the Black Panther Party, influence on people like Fred Hampton in Chicago. But then there's also, in ways that I've come to appreciate slightly differently, the influence of C.L.R. James on, for example, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit. His book, Notes on Dialectic, a book about Hegelian Marxism, is profoundly influential on the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in the early 1970s. So, there's an intellectual history here that's worth exploring, thinking about the various books and texts. Now, there are others that are more conventional that people talk about, but Fanon and his influence is often underappreciated. And even though James sort of has a renaissance in the 1960s as a result of this group in Montreal, eventually, it's through their work they eventually returns to the United States for the first time since the 1953 when he was forced to leave, and begins to have this kind of second life in the United States, and is very influential on people like Stokely Carmichael and others. But these ideas were part of what was circulating, that was shaping. So take the Student for Democratic Society, for example. The Madison, Wisconsin chapter, um, the figure of Paul Buell played a very important leadership role in it. And he was the editor of, well, what's the matter with me? What's the name of the journal? It was a New Left journal. The name will come back to me, and I'll let you know. And they start publishing James's work. They also start publishing work by the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, right? So there are certain ideas that were very influential during that moment. James had a relationship. He met Martin Luther King. They were together in Ghana during Nkrumah's inauguration in 1957, and they subsequently met in England. And there's correspondence between them. Malcolm X read James's essay, Revolutionary Answer to the Negro Question in the United States of America, while he was in prison, right? And they, so there are these points of convergence that I think are really important, that are all part of the equation that made the 1960s. These anti-colonial struggles. We think about here in Quebec how authors like Hubert Aquin were involved in making documentaries about African independence movements in Senegal and other places, right? So folks were attuned on multiple levels: Indigenous peoples, Quebec nationalists, African Americans, Black folks living in England who are reading people like George Jackson and other people too, as they were in, throughout North America. So there are all of these pieces that converge to make the 1960s what it was. And it's all part of the post-Second World War, so sort of sense of movement. The world is in motion. People in those parts of the world that were colonized are now seeing things, the kind of economic forces and the geopolitical dynamics shift around the world, and there's an opening, right, for these struggles that, even though they were struggling before, that space was not there in the same way. So, I guess what I've written about is a small piece of that historical moment in this context, but that small piece is part of, concentrated in that small piece is all these kind of international dynamics, right, that converged in Montreal.
Absolutely. I can't thank you enough, by the way, for like these very long and dense answers in this sense. But then
A
you're
bit
kind of
too
touching
long.
upon other questions. No, not at all. Like I love just listening to people, so it's great. And you're kind of answering other questions that I have in this case. And I just want to touch upon a few points that you said that I thought were interesting in this particular case. And you know, for example, when you were talking about issues of gender that arise in not only the Congress of Black Writers, but just more generally within these movements, I want to add in this case that this also is something that we've talked about on the show before in relation to, for example, the women's movement in Canada and elsewhere, right? That again, to use the term that you picked up on in this case, we can't think of these as siloed ideas, right? A lot of the women's movement were intrinsically related with what would have been left-wing movements at the time, right? Either socialist or otherwise. And there were conservative movements, of course, but like a lot of these powerful voices did emerge simultaneously in left circles and literary circles and racial anti-colonial circles. So all of these things are related in ways that I particularly appreciate reminding listeners of, both as something that we've talked about on the show and just as a constant reminder that ideas don't occur in a vacuum in this case.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very important point to make. And if you'll allow me, I actually want to read part of your book in this case, just at the start of the book, because I think there's a passage that really points to what you're talking about in this case.
Mm.
This is at the bottom of page 4. When you say you're talking more generally about, you're kind of introducing the history that you're you're going to be addressing in the book, and you say, but the Black Power movement had a strong presence in Canada and found a particular embodiment in the Montreal of the 1960s. The city became a quote unquote Mecca for the Black and Caribbean students and a center for revolutionary thought. The movement was an attempt by Blacks to exercise an internally generated vision of themselves and their place in the world. Black Power ushered in an era of heightened political consciousness in which Blacks asserted their right to live a life of freedom. In response to this assertion of Black humanity and the call for real power, quote unquote, of the people, Canadian and US state security, and you go on to talk about state security, which I won't, but this kind of idea, and I really like two terms in this case, the internally generated vision of themselves and their place in the world, I think is like a very central idea in this case to how we understand
Mhm.
these movements that are occurring in the 1960s, both in Montreal and elsewhere.
Mhm.
And I really appreciate the term of Mecca in this
Mhm.
case, both as an actual place that obviously exists, but
Mhm.
also as a symbol in this
Mhm.
case, right? The idea of the Mecca is a powerful one in a semiotic sense.
Mhm.
Um, and I kind of have a question in this case relating to this because you're obviously in a lot of your answers alluding to the influence that international communities from the Caribbean, Africa, and elsewhere have on Montreal. Can we equally speak of the influence that Montreal had outside? In this case, was that influence exported in a sense, right? Rather than having imported from Fanon, James, and elsewhere, as you were mentioning.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I would also add that quote unquote exportation or spreading was well out of proportion to the size of the Black population in Montreal. Um, so before I say that though, I just want to say something here that I think is so in some instances in the book, Black and Caribbean are used interchangeably, right? And particularly because it's Montreal, it's a convergence of folks from the Caribbean, some African American expatriates who are, fleeing from some had come here before that, but also as working as porters too and settled in Montreal, but also fleeing from being drafted into the war in Vietnam. Um, and then you have the long-standing Black community, which consists of people again from the Caribbean, some who are American, some from Nova Scotia, and some from, whose roots go much further back into Canadian history. But Black and Caribbean are not always interchangeable. And, so in some respects, Fear of a Black Nation is one portion of another story that I hope to tell at some point soon, which is about largely about Caribbean political intellectual production, so to speak, in this context, and the impact that it had both in Canada, in the Caribbean. And that's kind of my segue in response to your question. And that is that, when you look at the small number of people that were active, because sometimes we look at the 1960s and we think like the whole world was in the streets, right? But even when we see thousands of people, right, it's a small minority. Like
Yeah.
most folks were spectators, even if they were sympathizers, right? So, but in this case, we're talking about an even smaller community that had a disproportionate impact, in the Canadian context, right? So George is arguably one of the most important, significant student protests of the 1960s, not just in Canada, and had huge influence in Canada in terms of, government policy around race. Somebody could make the argument, although there's a burden of proof that it influenced Trudeau's multiculturalism policies. Um, and it put the conversation about racial exclusion, racial oppression squarely on the table in the Canadian context, right? Which kind of exploded the myth of Canadian innocence, right? So that's just in the Canadian context alone. In the broad international context, those events sort of alerted folks to the fact that, these tensions and antagonisms and contradictions, in terms of social relations that people thought about in other contexts, let's say in London, in Britain, or in various cities in the United States, they were playing themselves out for the same socio-historical reasons, similar historical socio-historical reasons in this context too. But there's also, you know, the fact that many of the folks that were here who were from the Caribbean would go on to play very prominent roles in other contexts. So Franklin Harvey, for example, was a member of the C.L.R. James Study Circle and the Caribbean Conference Committee, which is the Caribbean Conference Committee was an organization that organized a series of conferences up until 1967, which laid the basis for the Congress of Black Writers. Rosie Douglas was part of that group, and as were other members of the organizing committee of the Congress of Black Writers. So it was considered a continuation of the previous conferences, but except for this one focused on Black power as opposed to the Caribbean, Black internationalism as opposed to Caribbean politics and culture, etc. You know, Franklin Harvey came of age politically in this context in Montreal. He was studying engineering at McGill. As a member of this group that adopted James, C.L.R. James, as their mentor, not only was he involved in events in Trinidad in 1970, which is a whole other story, which, you know, I think it's not for now, but that almost led to the overthrow of the government of Eric Williams in Trinidad in 1970. But he was forced to leave Trinidad because he's from Grenada as a result of his involvement in those events, and went on to found Movement for the Assemblies of the People, a very much a kind of Jamesian self-organization based group, organization or movement, let's say, in Grenada, which eventually merged with other groups in Grenada to form the New Jewel Movement, which is the group that inaugurated the Grenada Revolution in 1979. And Franklin Harvey could have been one of the leaders of that revolution, but for various reasons, if we won't get into now, he opted out. But he was the person that drafted the manifesto for the New Jewel Movement, and a big part of that is tied to his popular movement approach, self-organization approach to politics, which was cultivated as a result of his relationship with C.L.R. James here in Montreal. And, depending on who's listening, the Grenada Revolution, I'm not sure how much people know about it, but, you talk about impact beyond, way out of proportion to size. Grenada, an island at the time of like close to 100,000 people, for a brief period between 1979 and 1983, occupied a huge space on the global stage because it was this tiny country that inaugurated this socialist revolution and that was standing up to American hegemony, American power in the Americas, right? What happens in Grenada, that's a whole other story too. But my point is that that's just one example. The other example I will give, because actually Between the Lines is about to publish a book about Rosie Douglas, who was involved in Sir George, as I mentioned, was one of the organizers of the Congress of Black Writers, was one of the principal figures involved in Sir George, is that, Rosie Douglas went to prison, and he served time in the Clare prison here in Quebec. And in many ways, I know people talk about Rocky Jones being a kind of Stokely Carmichael figure in the Canadian context, but so was Rosie Douglas, so was Rosie Douglas. And there's a whole other story about who Rosie Douglas was and his whole background. But what I will say, just in response, specific response to your question, is that when he was eventually deported after serving his sentence, and then, he was refused, Canadian landed status, etc., he was forced to leave. He returned to Dominica, where he became actively involved in Dominican politics, and eventually, in the early 2000s, became Prime Minister of Dominica. Mm-hmm. But where his real influence resided was as the head of the Mataba. Now, this is something that hasn't been spoken about quite a bit at all, actually. But Irving Andre gets into this in his new book about Rosie Douglas, which will be out in the fall, as I mentioned, is that, so the Mataba, how would you describe the Mataba? The Mataba was Libya's international solidarity organization, let's call it that. Right? Now, this is at a time when Libya was in a great deal of conflict with the United States, a wealthy, an oil-rich country, right, that had these socialistic leanings and these aspirations to play a very important role especially on the African continent, in terms of various liberation struggles, but also internationally. As the head of this international organization, Rosie Douglas was the principal person that negotiated Libyan support for the African National Congress, that is Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, at a very critical juncture in the anti-apartheid struggle. It was also that same Methaba that supported the Palestinian liberation struggles, right? Particularly the PLO, from what I understand, and the IRA, the Irish Republican Army.
Right. I remember that. Yeah.
So I just want folks to kind of stop and think about it for a second, right? Obviously, there's been a turn of events in Libya, and it's in a state of complete chaos at the moment as a result of particularly French and and direct and indirect U.S. intervention, etc. In that moment, the Methaba was a direct source of support, which meant financial support, which meant military support for these various political movements, right? Which were, this was touch and go. They negotiated peace in Ireland, right? But there were moments when that was really tenuous. We see South Africa today, and we can have a whole other conversation about the state of South Africa today. That's a different conversation, right? But that direct support to the ANC at a very critical period, right, during the anti-apartheid struggle, was crucial. And Rosie Douglas played this role. So, when he passed away, and, is when some of this kind of came to light, when you see who attended his funeral and the people that sent messages of solidarity and support, etc. So this is Rosie Douglas from this tiny island called Dominica, right, who comes here as a young man, first studying at what is now the University of Guelph, because his father owned a lot of land and he was going to study agronomy. He goes to Concordia, and then he's at McGill. He gets involved in St. George. He gets involved in this Caribbean Conference Committee, the C.L.R. James Study Circle, becomes politicized. And, he has this audacity about him, partly tied to his family background, right? And this way of just moving through all these circles. He was also a friend of John Diefenbaker, right? Head of the progressive conservatives, right? But
which is an odd combination, if
a
I may
very
say
odd,
so.
no, a very odd combination. But it happened because he picked up the phone when he was in Dominica and called the Prime Minister's office when he was having problems with his visa to come here to study. And they were probably so taken aback by the audacity of somebody to call and demand to get some answers that they called him back. So that was the beginning of their friendship when he eventually arrived here. But he also moved in those circles in Westmount, the same circles that Pierre Elliott Trudeau moved in before he became prime minister, right? So this is a very different world than the world that we live in when you talk about this kind of mixing and mingling, right? In many ways, I would say. But what I'm saying is that, in some respects, what I've just described in terms of Rosie Douglas is a very Caribbean story, right? Because, people forget that Frantz Fanon comes from a tiny island called Martinique, right? And C.L.R. James came from this place called Trinidad, and there's a whole list of Amy Césaire, Glisson, also from Martinique too. In some respects, it's a very typical Caribbean story that folks will leave these places in search of possibilities, right? And imagining, what freedom might be. And they sort of enter this world stage, right? An entire book or books could be written, on various Caribbean figures who, played kind of political roles in various different contexts, sometimes tied to the African continent in the case of George Padmore, or even Walter Rodney for that matter. Of course, figures like Marcus Garvey, internationalists like Claudia Jones. I mean, it's a very typical Caribbean story in some respects, but when you think about the implications of his particular story in relation to those movements, right? In many respects, it's a direct reverberation of the politics that he pursued in the Montreal context. And what I should add is that always in contact with that core group of people that were part of that group in Montreal, particularly his relationship with with Alfie Roberts. So those are just two stories in terms of like the international reverberations. Probably not in the way that you were probably imagining in terms of like, how these things sort of go, like
Yeah.
this kind of focal point and outwards. But,
It's never that clean.
yeah, well, that's it. And, and of course, like to the extent that, ideas and movements, spread, right, and find a home in other contexts, it's because similar socioeconomic circumstances exist in those contexts. So it's never really spreading in the sense because the conditions are already there, right? But what these folks were able to do in terms of their actions, but I also want to emphasize in terms of their ideas, their thinking, and what they wrote, the ideas that they engaged, right, is that they influence people well out of proportion to their size, well out of proportion to their size. Just as, Rosie Douglas, Tim Hector was another figure who was part of this group, and Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, they died like the closest of friends. And it goes back to that historical period, and, by this time, Kwame Ture is living in Guinea, right, where he's, the head of the All African People's Revolutionary Party.
Yeah.
And, they're all in conversation with each other, is what I'm trying to say. They're all part of this informal network, right? They were all actually involved in this, in the Mataba. That's a whole other story. Yeah, that's a whole other story. And
One that
Andre,
deserves its own book.
yeah, well, you might find it interesting to have Andre Irving on at some point when his book comes out, because he's done a lot of research, meticulous research. I mean, I read things, and he's writing about Rosie Douglas, who I knew, and I know his kids. I mean, his kids, they're grown adults, but his kids, and I discovered things about him that I had no idea about.
You bring up an interesting point here. Curious to kind of shift the conversation just slightly in this case to talk about other aspects that you raise in the book. And as I was reading, one that I would like to know a bit more about, and also because it fits in with the general idea that we kind of go with the show, is the cultural aspect in this case. Whenever I think of social movements, whether it's in the context of Black-based movements or indigenous movements, you can think of the civil rights movement that used that a lot, or even around this time in May 68, that was happening in France, and worker uprising that was happening, right? All of these movements mobilized and you used art and culture in really interesting and very diverse ways. And I'm wondering if we can speak of how, Black activism in Montreal around the time that you are talking in Fear of a Black Nation also perhaps mobilized art to contribute to their political goals.
When I saw that question, I had to think about it quite a bit and realize that, it's one of the underrepresented parts of that period in the book, that I haven't thought about a lot in relation to that historical moment in Montreal. And it's so interesting. And I actually can't explain to you exactly why. And the reason why I'm saying why I can't explain is it's actually quite puzzling actually for me, because, I've written about the poet Linton Kwesi Johnson, who was very much influenced by C.L.R. James. In a different context, he's Jamaican, British, and he's in London. He kind of comes of age in the 1960s as a 60s and 70s as a teenager, and is influenced by a lot of the same artists. So, in terms of literary figures, and you think about the Caribbean Conference Committee, as the organizers of those conferences that precipitated the Congress of Black Writers, their first keynote speaker was George Lamming, the writer from Barbados, who died last year or the year before. Brilliant writer, author of The Castle of My Skin, which is a kind of foundational book in terms of conceptualizing, the coming of age Caribbean nationalist story, West Indian nationalist story. He was their keynote speaker. So clearly, literature and his writing, I know they were also reading, Wilson Harris, the very kind of complicated writer, philosophically speaking, from from Guyana. They're reading the Guyana Quartet. Their first guest that they planned to invite was Aimé Césaire. Now, Aimé Césaire was, a politician, right? He, at one point, was a member of the Communist Party of France, representing, Martinique and, representing as the mayor of Fort-de-France in Martinique, but also representing those overseas territories in the Caribbean in the French National Assembly. And, at the same time that Pablo Picasso was a member of the French Communist Party. So they were friends, and he eventually leaves the French Communist Party. But I'm saying that because, some folks know Aimé Césaire as a political figure only, and make reference to the book, Discourse on Colonialism, right? A very important book of the mid-1950s. But Aimé Césaire was first and foremost a poet. And it's interesting to me that he's one of the people that they turned to for their first conference, but he was not available for various reasons. And it's interesting not only because they were obviously attuned to Aimé Césaire's poetry as an important influence and his other writing, but Césaire had a huge impact in Quebec. André Ferretti, Paul Chamberlain, and various other Quebec poets of the 60s and 70s would tell you that Césaire was the single most important influence on them. In fact, Jean-Daniel Lafond has done an entire documentary on Aimé Césaire's impact on poetry in Quebec during that period. So, literature for sure was absolutely part and parcel of the consciousness of the Caribbean folks who were involved in that, historical period. And, poetry from the Harlem Renaissance and poets like Langston Hughes were also very important. Music, sorry?
We can even think of I was thinking of this because you mentioned Aimé Césaire, but in the wider context of the Pan-African movement, right? In Senegal, what's his name? Léopold Senghor was a poet as well as a very influential thinker.
Absolutely. And of course, Senghor and Césaire were friends. They're the founders of the Negritude movement, right? You're absolutely right. It's often forgotten that James was an artist, right? And I say that because even though he stopped writing fiction in the 1930s, art was very much part of his political imagination. And when he was meeting with these young Caribbean students in Montreal, he was discussing Caribbean literature, right? He was discussing, Shakespeare in terms of politics, right? Like King Lear, as representing the shift from the old world to a new world, the shift from a kind of agricultural-based society towards, what would eventually evolve into what we understand as capitalism today. So even from that perspective, James' involvement in terms of thinking about the arts was very important too. Many members of the Caribbean Conference Committee and people that were just around and involved politically, they were, music lovers. And there was still a thriving jazz scene in Montreal during that period. When I moved to Montreal, back to Montreal in 1990, I think the Rising Sun had already burnt down. There was a fire in the club. But, shortly after that fire, if I remember correctly, they released a series of CDs, which included people like Nina Simone, I think people like Archie Shepp and various jazz musicians who would visit Montreal regularly. And there was another club, and the name is just not on the tip of my tongue at the moment, that was really important during that period, right? Which is to say that, music was huge. Now that's jazz music, especially jazz music, I would say. As we, but also it's the period of Motown, of course, and eventually as we kind of seep into 1970s and Marvin Gaye becomes more political, that classic album, What's Going On, but also the music of Curtis Mayfield, but then going back to Mariam Makeba. It's interesting because Mariam Makeba was in Montreal during the Congress of Black Writers. As far as I know, she did not perform and did not speak during the Congress, which is quite remarkable because by then she was already an internationally renowned singer, but also in terms of her politics was understood as being a kind of symbol of the anti-apartheid struggle, Now she was here because she was married to Stokely Carmichael at the time. But to me, it's still quite remarkable that she did not play a direct role in the Congress, given that she was here. There was a poet, I mentioned her a little bit earlier, named Barbara Jones, who taught at McGill. She was a geneticist, but she was also an established poet. Her book, the one that was known, and I mentioned it because it was a book of the 60s that captured, she has poems about the Vietnam War. She has poems about, Amiri Baraka, Leroy Jones. She has a poem about Martin Luther King. And, she has poems about depression, and love and all kinds of other themes, like in this relatively small book, but a very important book of poetry in terms of capturing, the spirit of that historical period. What's the name of the book? I think it's Amongst the Potatoes, right? Which is like speaks to her profession. She was a geneticist that worked with plants. We forget that people like Oscar Peterson. Oscar Peterson's from Montreal,
Yeah.
and I know, for example, Alfie Roberts, for example, was very much into the jazz scene, and had a huge collection of music. Of course, I have to mention calypso because calypsonians in the Caribbean region had basically become the voice of the people.
Yeah.
And one in particular, obviously, who was arguably the most influential singer, songwriter, calypsonian of his, not just of his time, but ever, is the mighty Sparrow, originally from Grenada, but is known as Trinidadian because he spent most of his life in Trinidad. Folks in Montreal would have been attuned to his music because he was Sparrow and was internationally famous. But politically speaking, James was one of those people that quite early on in the 1960s, in his book Party Politics in the West Indies, paid very close attention to his lyrics as a popular expression of the mood of people in Trinidad and in the Caribbean. So, folks who are reading Party Politics in the West Indies were being exposed to a side of an analysis of Sparrow, this singer-songwriter, right, from a political perspective. So, just given the large Caribbean population, the long-standing Black Canadian population that, that grew up listening to the blues and jazz going back to the 1920s and 1930s, some of this is actually captured in, I wanted to mention this, so I'm glad you asked this question, Mayruth Sarsfield's book, No Crystal Stair, does a wonderful job of capturing, there it is, right? A wonderful job of capturing the mood of that period in the 1930s, 1940s, right? And, and you get the sense, like, people like Langston Hughes are mentioned, various, musicians and artists, you get the sense that the Harlem Renaissance was very influential in Montreal, and you get a sense of people working as porters on the trains and the kind of the porosity of that border as far as people of African descent were concerned, so absolutely. And again, to be honest, I'm also baffled in my own way, as I said, that it's something that, I guess one book can't do everything, but that clearly I could have paid a bit more attention to that because, music is like that space in between. Like it's like, it's not an event. It's what sustains people. Music and culture is what sustains people in their daily lives, and, if I had actually asked many of the people that I've interviewed the question that you asked me, so many things would have come up in conversation that were not mentioned in those interviews, for example, right? Because it's just like, it also opens up another space of consciousness that we all kind of take for granted because music is always present. I'm mentioning music specifically. Music and, I know for sure that, the literature of people like Richard Wright, and eventually Ralph Ellison, and like people swear by James Baldwin during that period, like as capturing the tenor of that time. There was somebody, I just want to mention him. Roy States was a Black Nova Scotian lay historian who lived in Montreal. And actually his papers and his library is at McGill. It's part of the Roy States collection. if you to look at his book, just scanning all the books from his library, it gives you a snapshot of the kind of material: African history, African American politics, Caribbean and African American fiction, the few books that were written about Black Canada at the time, right? It's all just there, and you can just sort of step back and look at those books and get a sense of like the kind of transnational political consciousness and preoccupations of some folks living in the city at the time. And James Baldwin and Richard Wright are definitely part of his collection of books.
Very interesting. Yeah. And it wasn't to necessarily criticize something that you didn't
No,
necessarily
no,
talk
no,
about in this case, but I was just curious to
no,
know
no, no,
more in this case.
no, no. It didn't. I didn't take it that way at all. And even if it was, that would be
Right.
fine. It was more like a wow moment for me. I said, like,
Right.
I didn't ask folks about Richard Wright or the impact of George Lamming, not his presence here, but his writing. And I know that all these folks were reading these people, for sure. Some would have been reading Zora Neale Hurston and, other kind of Harlem Renaissance writers, and again, asking that question or asking about what music were you listening to, it just creates a different conversation.
Yeah. I have a last few questions here in this case, and one of them I think will shift a little bit the tone in this case of the conversation. So in this case, we've been focusing a lot on how these movements manifested themselves and their impact in this case. But I think an important thing to bring up whenever we are talking about these movements is the reaction to them, right? How people outside of these movements would have seen this. And one of the elements I think that comes up throughout Fear of a Black Nation in this case is the idea of state security needing to be maintained.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I think we kind of take for granted in the world that we live in, right? And I'm wondering how we can use this idea to talk about the kind of official political reaction to what was happening in Montreal in the 1960s. And if you had anything to say about that, were like in terms of crackdowns or anything like that, or in terms of like official responses, what can we say happened in this time and why is it important to?
Sure. Well, it's so interesting how I came to think about Canadian state security as a representation of the state's response to Black political organizing in Canada during this period, because up until probably 2010 or so, it hadn't been a preoccupation at all, not really. And then I read Giorgio Agamben's Means Without Ends.
Oh yeah, okay.
And then started to read a few other, his other work where he writes about the state of exception, etc.
Homo sacer.
Yeah, Homo sacer is one of them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then I also read somebody who I had resisted reading for a very long time, and that's somebody by the name of Michel Foucault. And the reason why I resisted him for a very long time is because I just didn't like this idea that there was probably 90s even into early 2000s, there was a time when it's almost like you couldn't speak without citing Foucault. Yeah. But then I came to discover that despite the sort of bandwagon popularity, there was some really important insights that he had on the dynamics of power in relation to biopolitics, right? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, when you put Agamben and Foucault together, right? And I also read around that same time, Saidiya Hartman's book, Scenes of Subjection, right? Which is also about biopolitics in relation to slavery. And in many respects, is sort of filling in that gap where both Foucault and Agamben, in talking about biopolitics, right, and the policing and politicking and surveillance of human beings, right, they talk about it in a way almost as if, in Agamben's case, because he's a contemporary philosopher writing about, mostly for the most part, about the modern world, at least in Means Without Ends, right? Yeah. Right? It's almost as if biopolitics is a modern invention, and I can't overstate how much I appreciate Agamben as a philosopher and his work. But there's an issue, and that is that he's talking about this notion of the state of exception, this idea that we live in a constant state of emergency, and he's writing partially in the post 9/11 context, right? Mm. When people who were enslaved and colonized had long been living in a permanent state of exception where the laws and legal codes, etc., and rights and entitlements that applied to the wider population never applied to people of African descent in the United States or to indigenous peoples, right? So, and still don't. So, that has always been kind of curious, right? You're talking about state policy, state of exception, policing and surveillance are a certain way, and like you're missing a big part of it. Foucault, again, profound appreciation for him as a thinker. You're writing about 18th, 19th century France and Europe, right? And, not a word about slavery, which is actually quite startling, shocking actually, but it's actually also quite typical, compounded by the fact, by the way, that when he visited the United States in the early 1970s, particularly when we consider he's well known for writing about prisons, the first prison that he encountered, as far as we know, was Attica Prison, shortly after the Attica Uprising, right? And then he ventures into Harlem and begins thinking about the dynamics of race and class when he sees how, poor Black folks live in Harlem. And then because of his connection to Jean Genet, the French playwright, who was very close to members of the Black Panther Party, he's introduced to members of the Black Panther Party and their literature, right? And yet when he's delivering his lectures, like, for example, Society Must Be Defended, which is a book that I swear by in some ways, in terms of its insights, it's quite remarkable, right? And yet, where's your conception of colonization? Like, where's France in relation to Haiti? Where's France in relation to its colonies? Where are the insights that you gathered from your observations and association, Angela Davis, Newton, reading George, the remarkable, insightful, brilliant George Jackson, of the Soledad brothers, right? They're nowhere to be found. So then I began to ask myself the question as a result of that, so where is the state in relation to Black folks in the Canadian context? So like, when you hear the stories, everybody's familiar with the FBI in the US context, et cetera, but like, where's that analysis in the Canadian context? Now, of course, there are folks that have, written about Canadian state security in the Canadian context, but even in many of those books, like, there may be a passing reference to people of African descent, right? But given my preoccupation, right, I was interested in, well, what were these files saying about? And clearly what you discovered is that they were spying on these groups, surveilling these groups, but worse than that, not only did they have a presence, they had their agents within these organizations and groups, but they were, in some instances, serving as provocateurs, encouraging Black and Indigenous folks to engage in acts of sabotage and subversion, what will legally be called subversion, so that they could be arrested and detained. And in some instances, it worked. So, that was informative because, you could have assumed that it was there, but reading these archives in detail, where, for example, there are detailed, almost word verbatim accounts of what happens in a meeting. So you know that they were present in those meetings, right? They had Black agents in those meetings spying, right? People who were trusted, who were seen as members of the community, and this is what they were doing. But of course, they also serve as archives because they capture word for word, and also they collected all the documents of these groups and organizations. So in some instances, the best archives on many of these organizations and groups are in the state security archives, in the National Archive. So that was really insightful. And of course, because I'm writing about that historical moment, to think about our own. And then there was the general strike in 2012. And I remember giving a talk at McGill just before it was somewhere in Montreal, before the book came out. And I remember talking about the state security stuff. And there was one person in the room who had been an active member in the student strike. And I just had this sense that, that particular point was not registering. So I stopped for a second and paused and said, I hope you understand the significance of what I'm saying here. These reports are coming from agents who are members of these organizations. That's why they have these accounts. And I saw it click in this person's face. Her whole disposition and facial expression changed, as if to say, oh, because then she began to think about like her own involvement, and you don't know who is who sometimes. And that's just the nature of being involved in political organizing, right? You don't know who is who, right? And, it came out, was it during the G20 protests of 2009 or 10, some of the people that were smashing the windows were working for the state.
Yeah.
That's quite typical, right? But what was surprising, or what is surprising for me, and I guess because I spent a lot of time reading these state security files, but also just from my own understanding of history, and before, even when I was much younger, particularly African American history, is that like I always assumed that that's the case. So what's
Yeah.
surprising for me is that people are surprised, right? And
And you can see examples of this also with I've found out recently that the RCMP also has like a whole history of sabotaging in the name of other political groups, like for example the FLQ. Right, you were bringing up Quebec nationalism around this time. Like there were acts of terrorism that were conducted by the RCMP, and they just said it was the FLQ. Right? And you're like,
it, it's
wow,
actually it's actually textbook practice,
right?
right? So I guess, without sounding too, hopefully not sounding holier than thou, there's a kind of naivete sometimes when people engage in political organizing, right? And it's not, you don't want people to be paranoid and constantly looking over their shoulder. But like, look at the world that we're living in today and look at the capacity for surveillance. So we're talking about the 1960s, right? Which meant a different kind, but now like, so much organizing takes place through social media.
Mm-hmm.
And there are ways in which people can sort of literally be into your lives in your living room. So more so than any other period in the history of humankind, actually, surveillance is a way of life.
Oh yeah.
Right. So, the book is only 10 years old. So like this is not a new phenomenon. And it wasn't a new phenomenon in 2012. So, I guess my point is that was one instance before the book was published where I began to think about the importance of thinking about that historical moment in relation to ours, and also seeing that person's response. So it made me realize that like that was an example or affirmation of the importance of linking the past to our moment.
Very interesting, and it's interesting to think about it, especially in the current moment. And this kind of also leads to another question where it's like it's fascinating to me that in this moment where arguably surveillance is, like you're saying, larger than ever, that coincident. I don't think so coincidentally, right? It's at that moment where the awareness of the fact that these surveillance mechanisms exist is arguably, I would say, at its lowest, right? Like people understand in vague ways that data mining is a thing, for example, or whatever, right? You hear that one a lot. But I feel, especially reading your book and others around this time, that people had a more profound awareness in the 60s and 70s that this was a potential thing. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps I'm just like transposing my own perceptions of it.
I don't think
But
I don't think you're wrong, Patrick. I think it's worse than what you're suggesting,
mm,
because it's not only are you correct, but it's a bit more than that in the sense that we've accepted it, we're aware of it, and it's become part of our day-to-day lives. I mean, it's a kind of coup d'état in some respects, because
right, that's interesting. Yeah.
it's just there, it's accepted. We collectively speaking, on the generic we've accepted the advantages of using all these devices, because they're convenient and make our lives easier in so many respects, although we could make an argument that they make us work harder and that we're always working and carrying our work with us. That's another story, right? But we've accepted the convenience. I mean, let's look at it like, so I'm a product of the 1990s and 80s, right? Went to university as an undergraduate in 1990. If you had told me that by the early 2000s, we could have devices, cell phones, like that could fit in the palm of our hands. That's like
Yeah.
space movie stuff, sci-fi. But I'm still old enough to kind of step back from that and say, wow, sometimes. Like I'm speaking to my friend, let's say in Australia, or to my siblings in the UK or wherever, and I can see them, right? But for this generation, if you were born in the 90s or even in the 80s, right, it's always been there.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
we've accepted the whole package, and surveillance is part of the package.
Mhm.
Data mining is part of the package. Targeted advertising is part of the package. We've embraced all of it. When I say like embraced. Like, we don't like it, some of us, or some of us are indifferent or don't care. But the fact is that we're not protesting against it in the way that we should be, even though it's like, I mean, think about 1984, Orwell's 1984. I mean, could he have imagined how easy it would be to have, the state in our living room?
Yeah, probably not.
I don't think so. It's become that easy, and we're implicated.
Absolutely. And like you say, we're all guilty of that in a sense. It's just like every day almost I think about like, do I really need Facebook, for example, or things like that? And at the same time, the answer always comes down to, kind of is convenient. And I get this kind of lassitude towards it of saying, well, yeah, it sucks, but at the same time, everything else is going to mine my data anyway. So, like I might as well use it and communicate with friends, right? And
Yeah.
there's kind of this laissez-faire, so to speak, or like you're saying, I think the term acceptance is,
Mhm.
embodied in that use.
Well,
Yeah.
it's
Anyway.
it's funny because so I'm not on any social media at all, and I haven't been.
Mhm.
But like, even my understanding, I have kids, who are teenagers and early 20s. Like, Facebook is it's like it's generational. Like, so Facebook is kind of passé for like people who are like 21 and under, 22 and under, whatever the case may be, and people have moved on to all kinds of the media. I mean, even Twitter is beginning to feel old for some folks. I mean, aside from all the the internal dynamics with Twitter more recently, but it's just a way of saying that how, yeah, it's just interesting how we've come to. I was listening during the pandemic. I was listening to Zadie Smith. She was doing an interview on CBC and
Yeah.
talking about surveillance capitalism and how it's like the biggest threat to our civil liberties and freedom. And she was expressing all this outrage, and it was precisely this outrage that we've internalized it. We've been embraced it implicitly, and in that sense, the state has never had it so good.
Yeah. Louis Althusser would have a field day with that one on ideal.
There it is, yeah.
Right. Not to like veer too far off of the subject in this case, but I think it is actually a good segue into the final questions that I have in this case. And this is something that we've kind of alluded to throughout your answers, right? But this book is, yes, a historical perspective, like you were saying, a meditation, if you will, on this moment of the 1960s, but it's also very much about the present. And I think that's kind of embodied in the way that this discussion on surveillance and state power has kind of evolved. Um, and I'm curious, right, in what ways you feel like this moment that you are talking about in the 1960s. So yes, in terms of surveillance and state power, that definitely is one way in which we can learn from this. But in what other ways, perhaps, can this moment be particularly relevant for considering the present? Personally, I think of, you know, societal biases, for example, that are perpetuating, which is perhaps the obvious answer. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how, the present can learn or engage with these ideas that you're presenting in the book in more concrete and material way.
I think part of it is tied to, well, the first part I would say is that it's tied to what is present in absentia. That is to
Mm.
say that when we look at that period and the issues that were not discussed that have been placed on the agenda in different ways today. One obvious one, when you think about the Congress of Black Writers, for example, and you think about the women that were involved in organizing during that historical period, right? Many women, many of whom I've interviewed and had long conversations with, right? But they were not at the forefront of the discussion. It was very much a man's conversation around politics, right? And kind of asserting Black manhood and Black masculinity, right?
Yeah.
And and then we think about, I mean, BLM has its issues and problems internally, et cetera, but it came into being. BLM, as in, it's like the Black Lives Matter, as a manifestation of BLM, the Black Liberation Movement, comes into being, as a result of, three women. Interestingly, tied to a hashtag, of course, right? In terms of in our social media world, right? And, women who are also, in terms of their sexuality, right? Don't fit like kind of like don't fit in terms of the kind of heterosexual norms, etc. Right? We think about that in the 1960s. That would probably be inconceivable during that moment, right? You know, we think about how James Baldwin had to placate people because of his sexuality, and just you know, what that meant for him is like his humanity, not to mention his quote unquote masculinity, always being called into question or being an undercurrent, right? Um, uh, Same was true of Bayard Rustin, who was like a main advisor for Martin Luther King, but kind of had to exist below the radar because of his sexuality, right? So gender and sexuality are two issues that have been placed on the agenda in our time, which, you know, but I say that not just because I say, well, this has been this great shift, right? But in some respects, the two are dialectically related, right? So in other words, the absence of that conversation, right, has meant that people have been forced to push and emphasize that conversation both in the 60s, 70s, to the point where we've arrived in that conversation today. Right? That's one thing I would say. The thing I really take from the 1960s is political imagination, right? That thinking big and imagining human possibilities beyond what's immediately before us, right? And not realizing, not knowing, but hoping and believing that change is possible and acting accordingly, not knowing where your actions and imagination may take you because you can't predict it, right? And then seeing where, you know, which goes back to the question you asked me earlier about where folks landed and where their politics landed, sometimes decades after, right, is profoundly informative for me, right, in terms of, and should be profoundly informative for us, I think, in terms of thinking about what's humanly possible beyond what we imagine or beyond what we can anticipate, right? But of course, no struggle, no progress, to quote Frederick Douglass. If we're not doing anything, then nothing gets done. When we're doing things, right, we get some sense in the process that other things are doable, right? And that leads to things that we can't anticipate sometimes, right? So having that sense of political foresight, imagination, but also not always doing big. Thinking big is one thing, right? But recognizing that social movements can be sparked or quote unquote, I'm putting the finger quotes too, engineered by a small group of people, of like-minded people who have a vision and imagination. And that's the thing that I grasped from, you know, studying that historical period, but also my relationship, you know, with the people that were involved. Because many of the folks that were involved have become very, or were very close friends, because some of them are not with us anymore. You know, so, you know, but then, you know, just realizing that we have to believe that there are, you know, because things are bad in the world. You know, like you and I can sit here and we can talk about like the marvels of technology, this, that, the other, you know, and all this other stuff. And it gives us a false sense of security and stability because the world is falling apart around us, literally. And actually on the most fundamental level in terms of the natural environment, right? That affects everybody, although it doesn't affect all of us equally. That's important to me in terms of class, in terms of where you're situated geographically around the world, which then becomes also racialized too because of, you know, like you think about where the Caribbean may be in the next 25 to 50 years, right? Because of rising temperatures and rising sea levels as a result, or the Pacific Islands, right? We think about like toxic waste and dump sites, not only in Canada, in places like Nova Scotia, close to Indigenous and Black communities, but around the world, right? So all of these things don't affect everybody differently, but like we're you know, to use the common phrase, like we're past the tipping point. Right. So, you know, having said that, if we don't believe that another world is possible, to use a cliched term, then it's not possible. If we're not struggling to bring something else that's an alternative to this, then it won't happen.
I recently had that conversation with my father, actually. In this case, my father's a bit older than most. He actually grew up in the era that we're talking about, in this case, in the 60s. And I remember having this conversation with him where I I felt like, especially in Canada, I don't think it's true necessarily elsewhere, but we have that kind of lack of a long-term vision, right? And I equated it with an imagination of the utopia in this case. right? Which I feel that we've lost as a society, right? And it's kind of something that I feel should be taken up again, and I feel is particularly relevant to the way that people imagined their struggles in the 1960s and 70s, right? Is this ability to imagine a utopia. And I feel like utopia has been kind of perverted as a term, right? In a
Hmm.
sense, or at least made into a quote unquote dirty word, right? In which people are just imagine it in the negative sense of like, well, it's impossible.
Yeah,
But I think we need that sense of the impossible. And
absolutely.
I couldn't agree more in this particular instance, especially in a country that could change, right? And has the resources to enact change, for example, but we're not, I think, thinking wide enough in this case, or impossible enough to put it in a perhaps a weird formulation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's two things I would say. One is that fiction writing often has a way of reminding us of that utopia. And sometimes it even comes in the form of, dystopia, right? Because, I mean, in addition to Octavia Butler, there's,
Ursula K. Le
another,
Guin does that a lot.
yeah, and also the writer, very fond of us is Nalo Hopkinson. And some of her books are set, at least Brown Girl in the Ring is set in Toronto,
Mhm.
but it's imagining a world post dystopic or in dystopic, right? But it's also about human perseverance and struggle. It's not coincidental. A lot of people have been reading Octavia Butler more recently since the pandemic. I'm actually in the process of reading Kindred, which I had never read before. But
So good.
you know, so I want to make that point about fiction, but the other point I wanted to make was that the pandemic demonstrated something to us. So do you remember the beginning of the pandemic when airports were shut down, there was no travel, and then we began to quietly hear reports that, there was some notion that the ozone could repair itself because planes could, there's all this conversation about cars, but like planes are actually emitting fossil fuels directly into the air because they're in the sky, right?
Mhm.
And there were no planes, and there was a shift. So we then began to realize that, well, not realize, we were reminded that we're living with human-made disaster.
Yeah.
What's the
It's
what's the
almost like
term
the
that
answer is staring us right in the face.
absolutely? And what's the word everybody's using now? I mean, of course, we go through these phases, right? So the Anthropocene, right?
Yeah.
These are human-created problems. Like human beings are the problems. Now, I want to qualify the word we because, you know, obviously it's not you and I, right? So if we're being more specific, we're talking about the corporate world, the business world, that minority, and the affluent. And it's their greed, but also, going back to what we were talking about in terms of technology, our buying into it, right? That has brought us to the point where we are. Like, so you always use the example with my students about, the mineral coltan, right? Because it's used in every cell phone, right? So we see every so often, periodically, not so much these days, that there's this ongoing war, as you almost want to say, in the Congo. And that it's not
Yeah.
coincidental that's where that mineral is mined in large abundance, right? So, we want to understand about like a social, environmental devastation and destruction, you know, the fact that, these phones that we change every year or so for some of us or some folks, etc., right? We're all part of this machine. We're all part of this machine. But, that brief moment during the pandemic when economically the world, including Canada, was even forced to reorganize itself economically, right? Because people were out of work, people, all kinds of things that were happening in this kind of new economic adjustment, right? Which, without an imposition of a certain kind of welfare statism, people would not have been able to eat, right? So it demonstrated that something that, many of us have known for a very long time. There's a question of will, not possibility. It's a question of the will to change.
It's what frustrated me so much, to bring it back to what you were mentioning about the pandemic, right? When people started using, right, as it was kind of going down in terms of the its impact, when people started saying going back to normal. And that that just and I don't want like to swear that much on the show, but that's what fucking destroyed me in this case.
Yeah.
And of just saying, why? You have like an excellent opportunity here to just not do that, to not do the thing that we know is destructive, right?
Uh,
And of course, there, ties back into like the elements of state power and capital that we discussed earlier, but it was just baffling to me that that was just totally accepted. Of like, yeah, we should go back to normal now. It's like,
That's
well,
when
no,
that's when we realized that people had missed the point. That people had missed the
exactly.
point, and we missed the point at a time when actually those who wield power were somewhat vulnerable. Yeah, we missed the point. Right? Um, you could argue that, one area that was quote unquote exploited as an opportunity was like through BLM, through the protest post George Floyd, etc. Right? And that's still reverberating in terms of, and I think about it in terms of, because I teach in academic institutions where always talk about hiring and representation and who's inside the classroom. Again, how does institutional racism work? And of course, in the Quebec context here, the conversation has turned very backward in terms of this idea that there's no systemic racism in Quebec. I mean, this is being articulated, although obviously in other contexts in Canada, to be fair, people won't articulate that, but actually believe that. But that's one area, not just in academic circles, but also I saw it play itself out in unions and in other areas where a space opened up for a period, right? But that's also where we see the distinction between representation versus genuine reorganization and restructuring, right? So
Absolutely.
I'm not dismissing the politics of representation because they're important. At one level they're important, but you can have representation without the structures of power changing dramatically, if at all. And that's more than evident, right? And so we have to be clear about what we're asking for. What kind of change? Do we want more faces of a certain kind in high places that reproduce the power relations that that have institutionally, structurally, historically been there, right? That have led us to where we are? Or are we talking about something profoundly more significant that requires a different kind of imagination, which is why art is important, why the idea of the utopia that you mentioned is important. Creative imagination is important.
Absolutely. And if listeners want a perfect example of what you're talking about in this case of the limitations, although not to again remove from the importance of representation in this case, consider, I don't know, probably since the 80s at this point, how many times institutions like universities or major corporations have launched, formal statements saying we're dedicated to changing structures of racism and discrimination within our institution. Okay, how? How are you fundamentally planning on doing that? And most of the time, that question is just left unanswered because it was written on a piece of paper and thank you very much, goodbye, in this case.
Well,
Um,
the answer today is EDI, right? Equity, diversity, and inclusion, right?
there you go.
So now there's an answer. And again, I'm not going to ultimately or absolutely dismiss EDI in terms of what it may mean to have a representation of folks who may see and understand the world differently in positions of authority, right? But I'm also not going to assume that that's what EDI means either, right? That you will have more people who absolutely see and understand the world differently politically, economically, in positions of power and authority. But even with that, even if we accept that, that in and of itself does not change the structures of power. So when people are saying that this is how when they respond to that question, your question, so what are we going to do to improve these things that we're committed to, right? They're clearly not talking about fundamental change, even in their commitments, because it's not in the interest to. And I think, once we can really understand that, then we ask a different set of questions or a different set of demands, right? But if we think representation in and of itself is the answer, then with some reluctance, that's ultimately what we will get. And then recognize that the dynamics of power do not shift on those terms, definitely not alone, right?
Absolutely.
And that when we're talking about more fundamental change, we're talking about structural change, like deep-seated structural change. So the world would look very different from the world that we're living in. And, however that sounds, depending on who's listening, right? That sounds like outlandish, but like, if we don't think we need radical solutions to the radical problems that we have in front of us, then we're deluded. Like,
Again,
In
to
this
come back to
context,
what you said, you've missed the point.
absolutely. If we, radicals, the quote unquote new normal, it has to be in the world that we're living in. I mean, I'm looking, we're talking here. I'm looking through my window. It's bright and sunny outside, but the flowers are blooming, this, that, the other. It's kind of surreal. It's surreal in relation to where we were just a year and a half ago, number one. But it's surreal in relation to how most people are living in this world. And we have yet to adopt consistently a language to describe where we're at in the world that's commensurate to the problems that we're confronting. We're not there. We're not even close.
Very interesting. So I just wanted to end off with a few questions, namely two actually that I like to ask to every guest. And I would like you, if you want, to share a particular part of the book that
Mhm.
you found to be particularly interesting or that you feel would be of interest to readers to think about.
Yeah. So this is on page 82, where I'm trying to, it's in the conclusion called Still a Problem, the last chapter. And it's me trying to think about how our preoccupation with race leads us to not fully understand and appreciate what race actually is. And I'll just go ahead and read. So purely racial solidarities are problematic. We cannot we cannot ignore that race is more complicated than race, to use a tautology. Looking through the prism of racial oppression, we can also come to recognize how the factors of gender, class, and sexuality and the lives of Blacks cast light on a range of social and political issues. A racial solidarity that unquestioningly embraces those Black elites who cautiously betray the Black majority is problematic. Yet to use the word betray here is to encourage the simple fiction that racial solidarity always trumps class considerations. And then I go on to say in the next paragraph, unfortunately, we have to drag ourselves deeper into the gutter of race and racism in order to emancipate ourselves from it. Getting beyond race requires excavating the core attitudes and deeply embedded racial codes that govern white supremacy. The idea that people of European descent are intellectually and culturally superior to all other groups, and that therefore their cultural, political, and economic dominance is a natural, inalienable, and uncontestable right. Once again, we are speaking to the everydayness of racial codes that shape our daily encounters, codes that inform the attitudes of teachers in the classroom and influence the academic performance of Black students while undermining their mental and physical health. The mentality of armed police officers who confront Black youth in the streets, the hiring practices of employers. These prevailing fears inflate everyday relations with an irrational logic that in part explains why legislated attempts at eliminating racial exclusion without a commitment to transforming the narrative, attitudes, and cultural chauvinism that affirm race and racism, and I would add the structures that affirm it, have proven to be ineffective. And, I think that for me is my way of saying that, sometimes we talk about race as if it's this thing that just floats around independently, or racism as this thing that just kind of floats around, right? When the historical roots of our current version of racism, because it's taken many forms historically, including in Europe and other contexts, going back centuries, right, is tied to codes that were implicated during the regime of slavery and its equivalent under colonization in various parts of the African continent. We're talking about anti-Black racism. And while those codes were designed to ensure that the labor involved, that was both a constituent and constitutive part of what we now call capitalism today, right? Really important that we talk about like slavery in those terms, because then we also talk about resistance to slavery in those terms as being also anti-capitalist resistance, right? And anti-colonial resistance, right? Those racial codes have also assumed a life of their own in ways that go back to labor, because they impinge upon people's life chances in terms of employment, as well as in terms of mental and physical health, well-being, the rates of incarceration, which are tied to the plantation to plant to prison pipeline, as I refer to it, and just in ways that impinge upon our daily lives, that the term race or racism in its abstract use does not capture, right?
Yeah.
And, so I think it's important that we name what we're talking about and describe what we're talking about. So in the preface, in the acknowledgments in the preface to the new edition of We Are a Black Nation, I mentioned somebody named Nika Spring, who in December of last year was arrested just around the corner from where I live, actually. Not too far from where I live. Young Black man in his early 20s. So already he was profiled, for lack of a better word. He was picked up because he was Black. There was nothing on his, no banner on his head or anything that says, I've done something illegal. He was stopped, detained, and then arrested. He was taken to Bordeaux prison, which is also here in Montreal, and he was arraigned. The judge said, let him go on bail. I'm still not clear on the reasons why he was arrested. It's an ongoing investigation. For some reason, he was not let go, and he became agitated. A few days before Christmas, the day before Christmas, actually. He was restrained, pepper sprayed, a spit hood was placed on his face, over his head, pepper sprayed again, and thrown in the shower with the spit hood on his head, and then thrown in a prison cell. And that's how he died.
I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely
how he died.
Traumatizing.
Yeah, that's how he died. So, when we talk about this thing called race and racism, like it embodies so many things, and so much of it is encapsulated in the murder of Nika Spring. Come from a working class family. If he was in another neighborhood, maybe he wouldn't have been on the street at that time. Maybe he would have been in a car, right? So class plays a role, right? Where he lives and why he was picked up in that particular neighborhood, right? The fact that he was Black, in this case, a Black male, the fact that he was profiled, identified as somebody who should be stopped and detained, and then sent to prison and pass through the judicial system, right? And then just the tragic, barbaric circumstances under which he lost his life, right? It's all encapsulated in that, in his story in so many ways. And so I guess the point what I want to make is that, this is often life and death. So that's an extreme example because he paid the ultimate price. But think about all the kids in the classroom who are seen as that other non-human or less than human and how they're treated and how that impacts their life chances. Thinking about all the Black folks who go and speaking to their health practitioner and not taken seriously. And particularly happens to Black women, right? And it puts their lives at risk, right? You think about the callous ways in which nurses during the pandemic, many of whom were Black women, right? Because of the nature of that relationship between, Black women, especially from the Caribbean and that profession, who put their lives at risk during the pandemic and were not protected, not to mention adequately contemplated, went back to their neighborhoods where they lived, right? And then their neighbors become pathologized during the pandemic because COVID is spreading because they're working in hospitals and clinics looking after people who are sick, right? So the point of that passage for me is that, race is not about race. It's this all-encompassing thing to the extent that we talk about it, this all-encompassing thing that impinges on people's lives in various ways in terms of gender, race, class, sexuality, right? In terms of, the judicial system, policing, the prison system, etc. And when we start thinking about it in those terms, then we get a little bit closer to understanding what needs to be changed. It's not just because somebody said something not nice to me, right? Yeah, it's not like, we need to, get beyond that. So when, the Premier Legault says that there's no structural institutional racism, look who's disproportionately incarcerated in this province. Look who's disproportionately killed by police officers.
And we like to think, as part of the Canadian myth, that we always compare ourselves to the United States still to this very day and say, well, look, we're better than that. Well, no, the same structures that you're talking about in this case that are literally in the core of the way that this country was built are still at play in this in this century, in this decade. And that gets to the heart of what you're talking about.
We need to get beyond this myth of Canadian innocence has been killing people, mm-hmm. Right? Oh, yeah. Because it allows folks to turn a blind eye or to behave as though they're surprised when things like happened to Nika Spring, which unfortunately there have been many Nika Springs in one form or another whether it's incarceration or by police, right? So we need to get beyond the surprise because it's, you know, it's life and death.
Now, the last question I have here is perhaps a bit of an unconventional. What didn't I ask in this interview? And what's the answer to that question?
Well, I don't know where to begin with that. We've talked about a lot of things, but I think what you haven't asked me is what's my motivation for doing this work, I think. And I'm not entirely sure that I know the exact answer to that question.
Interesting.
I do know that I was raised in households where politics were always discussed, by grandparents, parents. But I think the short answer is that ultimately, we organize to change the world. But I think that ideas are profoundly important in terms of how we imagine what's possible in terms of organizing to change the world. So writing, thinking, ideas, often represent congealed experience, right? Where we can distill even sometimes centuries of history in ways that inform our understanding of what's possible today. Just like, philosophy and theory is like, that the kind of crystallization of centuries of ideas, right? That which then, we have at our disposal, or the way that poetry opens up a space in our imagination to think about possibilities beyond the present. I think that's why this work is ultimately important. And I don't want to reduce all art, thinking, poetry ideas to this kind of utilitarian
Of course.
way of seeing. But honestly, Patrick, with everything we've talked about today, and given the world that we are living in, if that's not our major or central preoccupation, don't get me wrong, we need a word of art and beauty, because that speaks for itself and it reminds us of the kind of world we want to create, right? Mm-hmm. But from the vantage point of somebody who thinks and writes, for me, it's about creating that space for us to learn from what has been, to think about what is possible, right? And that we think in order to do, right? And really, that maxim that, philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways, that the point is to change it. I think that's, and also Frederick Douglass's conception of no struggle, no progress. I think I kind of live by those two things in many respects. But the point really is to change the world. And as grandiose as that sounds, that's where we're at. And, we start of the little piece of the world that we're most familiar with, at least that's where I start, and work outwards.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And can you tell people where perhaps they might be able to find Fear of a Black Nation in its republication?
Well, it hasn't, I don't think it's in bookstores yet, but it will be by the end of this month. I actually, it's funny, I was at an event in Toronto the other day and I saw a copy of it sitting there. I hadn't seen it yet. So I actually don't even have a copy of the new version yet. It should be coming soon. The new edition, sorry. But it's going to be in most bookstores, I think. I'm sure there are various places where it can be ordered online from bookstores. And I think it's important to encourage independent bookstores, right? So I'm not going to mention that big bad name in terms of where people mostly, or, like try and buy books from bookstores, I think, as much as possible. Fortunately, one of the positive things that came out of the pandemic is that a lot of publishers, especially small publishers, did really well because people were ordering books, because they had more time on their hands. And also maybe they're asking questions about the world too. So left publishers the few of them that I'm connected to in terms of, my work being published, the pandemic had something of a silver lining for them. So, we should encourage folks to also support smaller bookstores, right? Because there was a point not too long ago where questions were being raised about whether bookstores are going to survive. And we shouldn't assume that question won't be raised again.
Well, thank you very much, David, for your very, very generous time, in this case, talking about Montreal in the 1960s and all of the very fascinating ways in which it connects to, global politics, past and present. And I'm looking forward to finding your book in bookstores. I have an advanced reading copy, but I will definitely be picking up a regular copy when it comes out. Thank you again. And is there anywhere where people can perhaps contact you if you want in case of further questions? If not, that's totally fine.
No, sure. Well, I mean, it's easy to find my email at where I teach at John Abbott College. That's where I teach full time, and always open to conversations.